hopefully I don't need to introduce myself very much except to say that I'm not competent in any given area, but I've dabbled in many. So I did medicine first, and then as I left home to go to medical school, my mother said, "Beware of philosophers," quoting St. Paul. And so I immediately signed up for a philosophy course, which was boring. I didn't stay with it for very long, a year. Then went through medicine, got bored with that. My wife fortunately found me in Oxford, where I was doing some further training, and foolishly married me. Then we were both career people, so families were not on the agenda, but we were careless, and shortly we had 3. Well, 4 was a little later, wasn't it? Yeah. 4th was yet to come. So very shortly, I was doing internal medicine, going out before the children were awake and coming back when they were asleep, far too often for my wife's convenience. So I did a PhD to see my children, which is an unusual reason for doing a PhD. But it worked. And when that came to an end, my wife said, "You're not going back to internal medicine, are you?" And it wasn't a question. I'd promised her we'd travel, and so I had the good fortune to invent a new technique, which is wonderful, particularly if you're a little cynical, because you control the literature for a few years in that particular area. And I went looking for an application and found it in severely malnourished children. So I went to the Wellcome Trust and said, "Here's the problem, here's the technique, will you pay?" And they said yes. And then we lived in Jamaica for 6 or 7 years, and they paid all the bills. This is really too good a life for anyone to have, but it was ours. I didn't even have to write grants. 1 letter a year of not more than 2 pages, and the trust paid everything. They're the world's greatest employers. If you ever get the chance to work for the Wellcome Trust, do it. But all good things come to an end. In this case, it was Mrs. Thatcher who brought it to an end. We're actually refugees from Mrs. Thatcher. That's why we're in Canada. She cancelled my job, which I was supposed to go back to in London. But fortunately, one turned up in North America very quickly, and we came to Ottawa, not knowing what we were coming to. We think it's one of the nicest cities in the world to bring up children in, and we've seen lots of them. The alternative was Boston. It doesn't come close for bringing up a family. So that's the kind of background I have. So I was appointed in biochemistry and pediatrics at the University of Ottawa. And some years in, things began to change. And so 16 years ago, well, actually 20 years ago, a group of us were brought together, some of whom are here tonight, in a reading group initially, because we had all watched a well-known phenomenon happen, that young people come from devout Christian homes with a somewhat naive faith, and then are stripped of that faith during their 4 years in university. Somewhat cynically, I often say that when your children go to university, if they can't deal with the issues the university cares about, and my initial grid is reductionism, relativism, tolerance, multiculturalism, the sanctity of life, and sexuality, if they haven't got their views sorted out on those in a way that they can defend, then sadly I have colleagues who will strip them of their faith very quickly. They're quite likely to come home at the end of the whole process without a faith, having lost their virginity and their minds as well. It's not good news. We were brought together over that issue, and we read together for about 5 years, and Augustine College was the result in the end. I don't know about the others, but I was not particularly keen to get involved in this project, and we built into the founding document that we could close if we went into the red, and we were sure that would happen. It's 16 years later, and it hasn't. And it looks to me very much as though God is at work in it, because on one occasion we did look as though to any sensible man, like, for instance, Frank Johnson, we were going to go into the red, but then a gentleman called me and said, "How's your college going?" And I said, "Pedagogically, wonderfully. Financially, disastrously." He said, "Would 25,000 help?" And I said, "Well, it would, but I don't know you, and how do you know me, and why are you giving me 25,000? And he said, "Oh, my favorite aunt has just died." And one of the last things she said to me as her executor, she said, "That young man in Ottawa, I love that. I like the college he's running, find out how they're doing. If they need help, give them some. That sort of thing has happened twice so far. So I've given up on the idea that we're going to get out of it that way. So what I said I would talk about tonight is talking about wisdom in an age of information. Now, I've already pointed out that we live in an age that is morally confused. We don't have a moral consensus. You can say to any audience of medical students, and I often do this when talking to them, I say, if I was to say to you that within 6 weeks of starting medical school, you decided there were people in your class about whom and to whom you would never trust the care of a dog of yours, what would you say? And all around the room, there are ironic smiles. The answer is yes. And I say, if we took a consensus vote in the class about who these people are, would there be agreement? And the answer is yes again. The university never knows anything about these people. They lose their license 5, 10 years after graduation for horrendous behavior. But no one in their class is surprised. But the faculty never know. There's nothing on their transcript. Now, they're not immoral so much as amoral. As you will hopefully come to agree with me by the end of the next hour, there are reasons for this that we can understand, but they are missing an important part of development. So then I say to the class, well, let's leave them out, because if we're talking, say, about abortion, then what we're talking about is what, if any, duties do we owe to human beings before they're born? And that's a moral question. Amoral people can't even begin to answer it. So let's leave them out. Now, apart from issues of life and death and sexuality, do you trust your class to practice ethical medicine? And the answer is yes. But on issues of life and death and sexuality, there's no agreement at all. It's a 50-50 divide. That's our world, and it's a problematic one. And I spend a lot of time talking about it because in the past, such differences have led to civil war. I don't want that to happen, so we've got to learn to talk about these things in the public arena. That loss of moral consensus is absolutely fundamental to what's happening to us now. And that loss began, in my view, at least 500 years ago. A combination of things happened. Occam, of whom I'll say a little bit more later, the stunning success of inductive reasoning, which, by the way, was not a product of the Enlightenment or the Renaissance. Inductive reasoning in science was well underway by the 13th century. It was a product of the early Catholic universities, and people like Dawkins should acknowledge it. Without him, it wouldn't have happened. Another talk I give has the title, If Newton had not had his God, he would not have gone looking for his laws. There were no immediate practical outcomes to early science. It was done for love of learning and to understand God's world. But Occam's nominalism, reductionism, combined with the really disastrous handling of the Galileo affair, led to a rapid loss in credibility for the church and a huge gain in credibility for science, which gradually became more and more reductive. And so that real knowledge became to be knowledge that could be appreciated with your senses or their extension in instruments. The real thing that got lost, of course, was moral knowledge. That was privatized. So nowadays, many kind-hearted liberals think there should be no space in the public arena for anything to do with religion, right? Obama and Hillary Clinton want to change it to freedom of worship, not freedom of religion, because they want to remove it from the public square. Now, they're foolish, I think, and I hope to be able to show you why and how to argue with them. The next step in my journey, I was brought up in a devout, if somewhat naive, Christian home, went off to university, and rapidly was got at by the university ethos, so that I became technically a reductionist. I became fascinated by science, and I was taught to see patients as disordered machines, and very soon I lost sight of the patient. So I became a research physician. Jamaica helped to begin to unpack this for me. I knew nothing about nutrition when I went there, but in the early 70s, I was beginning to become somewhat uncomfortable with the scientism of the next generation that were already emerging. What I was doing in Jamaica was dealing with 10-pound 2-year-olds, and I had the privilege of being part of the team that worked out how to deal with these children in the 70s. So over a period of about 7 years, it all came together. It was a 25-year program. I just happened to be there at the really exciting time when all the bits came together. And shortly before we left Jamaica in the late 70s, we went through 100 10-pound 2-year-olds and saved every single one. Now, that is something that it is a joy to do. I think the greatest joy was very occasionally, these children were brought by their mums. They didn't come through the normal system. They came from the ghettos where one mother would say to another, "Look at my baby, he's so thin. What can I do about him?" And they'd say, "The TMRU is the only place that can save that baby." And so these poor women from the slums would use quite a lot of their money on a bus fare up to the university and come to our unit and say, "Can you save my baby?" And we'd be able to say, "There's a very good chance that we will. It will take us about 2 months. Can we do some non-threatening research?" And they signed everything, of course. So we took that baby in, and often being poor and having a large family to care for, they might not come back for 2 or 3 weeks. And when they did come back, they would come in not through the main entrance of the unit, which was rather impressive, but round the back, through the veranda windows into the ward. And it was not rare for them to burst into tears because they couldn't see their baby. And then you had the great privilege, if you were there, to say, "No, don't cry. Your baby's here." And you'd take a baby that had almost doubled its weight since they'd last seen it. The baby recognized them before they did the baby. That's a marvelous thing to see. That's a pleasure that not many people have during their lives. But they did die occasionally, initially, more often than towards the end. The mortality rate for these children in Africa in famines is still over 50%. And Western doctors make it worse because the proper treatment is somewhat counterintuitive. But the macabre ending for the lives of those children who died, their heart would stop. And so somebody would start doing external cardiac massage. Now, intuitively, I knew that was the wrong thing to do. It took me a little while to work out a scientific reason why it was wrong. It's important to recognize I knew it was wrong for humanitarian reasons. Children should not die with somebody thumping on their chest. Well, not thumping in children that size. They should die in the arms of someone who loves them, preferably their mother. And that wasn't happening. So I then worked out the reason scientifically that I was opposed to this. It's perfectly worthwhile doing external cardiac massage on somebody who has a dysrhythmia of the heart and is otherwise healthy. But when these children's hearts stopped, it was because the whole metabolism of the body had come to the end of its life. And the heart stopping only made it worse. You were not going to resuscitate it. When I went through the data, we'd never resuscitated anyone whose heart had stopped on that unit. It's not possible. So I managed to stop that. But I realized it was my humble upbringing with parents who loved God that played a bigger role in me getting that right than anything else. I could rationalize it scientifically afterwards. So that was step one. And of course, all over the world, there's a worry about what we're doing to students at the moment in this respect. The next step was rather more complicated, but science on its own is not enough. As I said, we were successful, and we'd produced very straightforward protocols. And so I expected to see malnutrition disappear in the developing world. Nothing has happened in the next 35 years. The prevalence in Africa remains the same. That's upsetting. We could understand what to do, but there was no way of transmitting it into other environments where it was actually needed. In the late 80s, my family, I had to be bullied in going to Africa, but Sally and the children all wanted to go. We went to Africa for a year to help a mission group set up a refeeding program. Now, I'd been looking at the data every year for years. I knew that no one had succeeded. There was no effective program for refeeding malnourished children if you put into the evaluation the removal of all expatriate input for 2 or 3 years before doing your evaluation, which is a minimal requirement for enculturation. So I didn't expect it to work. I wasn't that arrogant. My children all spent their summers for the next few years resuscitating malnourished children, and that was good for them. But I could measure the decline in the program with an 8-month absence. So I wasn't doing enough work to satisfy my activist wife. She asked me what was the matter, and I said I was thinking, and she said, it looks as though you're doing nothing. And I, of course, said, that's what thinking looks like to you, and we had a classic family row. But she won, of course, and I'll tell you more of that in a moment. But within a year or so of starting this program, one of the nurses that I had trained had his own child die of malnutrition. That was an insult. And I said to him, what on earth happened? And he told me he wasn't going to tell me what he really believed by looking at the ground, not at me. And he said, well, we didn't feed him properly. But I knew that wasn't really what it was about. So I said to my supervisor, go and find out what he really thinks caused his child's death. And of course, he was back very quickly. Some of you have already guessed the answer, I'm sure. He said, oh, he believes that an evil spirit took the child's appetite away. Now, don't laugh at animistic paganism. It gives a better explanation for living than the current soft nihilism that you see around you coming out of high school every day. The suicide rates in that culture are much higher than they are in, say, Africa. If your family has mortality in childhood as a routine, your crops fail apparently at random, and you have some of the worst governments in the world, evil spirits make good sense of that. There's not too much evidence of a God of love. So there was no foundation for me to build on with nutrition education, which has all sorts of underpinnings that are necessary if it's going to work. They simply weren't there. So it can't be done in that way. CEDA's got it utterly wrong. It's basically a cultural disorder. But again, I'll leave that hanging and come back to it in the end. If I don't, you can remind me. The point is that information isn't meaningful without a context. Now, the easiest way to imprint that in your memory is with a lovely analogy from Donald Mackay, who was one of the first people to do X-ray crystallography, a mathematician, a physicist, ended up as a brain physiologist, but also a deeply thoughtful man. And he used to tell the following story. He said, I want you to imagine 2 scientists who are good friends going on holiday together. One of them is a Dawkins type reductionist who thinks science is all you need. The other one is a bit more thoughtful. And they're sitting on a cliff one evening looking out to sea, and a light starts to flash out in the bay. And the reductionist, of course, has his small laboratory in the back of the car, and he pulls it out. He says, I'll tell you all about that light. And he starts generating data. It's perfectly good data. He says it's a sodium source. He can tell you how far away it is. It's also flashing, and he can describe the frequency of the flashes. Meanwhile, the other guy is sitting there and thinking, once upon a time, I knew the Morse code. And he was able eventually to work out that the light was saying, the bit of cliff you're sitting on is about to crumble into the sea. Get off. They're all dealing with exactly the same data, both of them, but an entirely different outcome, isn't it? Information has a cultural context. Nowadays, I actually quite enjoy it when, on the secular part of my lecture activities, I meet someone who knew me when I was a reductionistic scientist. And in American universities, anyway, they put pictures of you up everywhere, and although my hair color has changed, I'm still recognizable. And so every now and again, somebody I knew from the past will turn up at a lecture on a subject they didn't know I talked about. And afterwards, if they're Brits, they'll be very rude and say, I haven't seen you for a while. And I say, no, I don't go to the meetings where we used to meet anymore. He said, yes, I used to read your stuff until the early 90s, the clear implication being that I lost my mind in the early 90s. And I say, you think I lost it? Yes, more or less. Well, I think I can prove that's not true. What do you call somebody who's really lost their mind? And of course, the answer is mad or crazy. What happens to their life? well, it falls apart, doesn't it? They lose everything. Now, when I started taking my faith seriously, my life didn't fall apart. Even my wife could probably be persuaded to say that there were some improvements. That's not the same story at all. My faith is not irrational so much as supra-rational. Your problem is that you have been hoodwinked into believing that I refuse to call it enlightenment, I prefer McIntyre's term, post-endarkenment understanding doesn't have enough space for my faith. My faith has plenty of space for reductionistic science. That's the right way to do it. But reductionistic science has no space for my faith. So which is the bigger box? That leaves them with something to think about. Scientific rationalism is good, but it's incomplete. Now, the next step in this journey, at least for the purposes of this evening, was T.S. Eliot. And Edward Tingley has provided you with reading matter in case I get too boring. You can pick it up and carry on. And this quotation is in there. It's from Choruses on the Rock. Where is the life we have lost in living? But the next two lines are the ones that really hit me. Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? I would add, talking to students anyway, that information without knowledge is useless, and knowledge without wisdom is dangerous. Information without knowledge is a medical student. Knowledge without wisdom is a resident. If you're very fortunate, your physician may have arrived at wisdom. But when you find yourself dying in the ICU instead of in your own bed with your family around you, you will probably be suffering from a surfeit of knowledge and an absence of wisdom. The old definition of medicine as curing sometimes, alleviating often, and comforting always is long since lost. The secret of caring for the patient is to care for the patient. Nowadays, it's not done that way at all. The old definition of medicine is not acceptable. It's been displaced by bureaucratically inspired protocols. And woe betide the physician who doesn't follow the protocols. Even when they ought not to be followed, it's easier for them to do so. There's a lot of this going on. There's a lot of defensive medicine done in the ICU, not for your benefit, but for the lawyer's benefit, or not their benefit, to be more precise. Defensive medicine. Just to put it in as something that you can think about and talk about in your church. Every church that's serious ought to have a power of attorney program for people in the church, so that when you find yourself in ICU, 3 people who are not afraid of the ICU will turn up. You know, a retired doctor, a lawyer, someone like my wife who won't take no for an answer would be a perfect trio. And they will soon be very, very welcome, because if they've got legitimate power of attorney, they can stop the nonsense at the end, so that you can die in your own bed with your family around you and no lawyer can do anything about it. Churches could provide that service. But I don't know how long it will be before that happens. Our university education, particularly in the sciences, and especially in the early years of study, makes little or no attempt to confront this problem. When I began in medicine some 50 years ago, it had a very different pattern of disease causation than it does now. And I have yet to find a textbook of internal medicine that discusses this. I wrote a paper about it 2 or 3 months ago in Touchstone. I don't know of another one yet. But 50 years ago, most of the patients who came to see me came because of what God or nature had done to them. Even smoking was not wrong at that point. Only 30% or so came because of their own behavior. Alcoholism, sexually transmitted disease would be the classic duo. Nowadays, that's totally reversed. At least 70% of patients come with a disease for which they are at least in part responsible. Now, if you are sick and suffering with a disease for which you are in part responsible, and those you say you love are therefore suffering with you, what must you handle as well as the diagnosis? Just say the word. It's good for you to say it occasionally. What's the word? Guilt, that's right. We're frightened to say it almost, aren't we? But it is a huge problem. And guilt doesn't occur in the textbook of an internal medicine textbook. That's amazing, but that's where we're at. It occurs in psychiatry, but when you look it up, it says guilt feelings, evidence of depression. That's reductionism. We need the re-emergence of the church in the context of medicine, because the only solution the world has ever found to guilt is confession, repentance, restitution, grace, justification. That's the only way you get to peace. I say to students, one of the reasons you're abusing drugs and alcohol at the rate you are is because you're guilty, but you don't even know what the word means. You don't believe in objective moral truth. Sin is going against objective moral truth. That therefore doesn't make any sense to you. So there's no solution to your real guilt in your language. You don't have the words to deal with it. Even in many of our churches, there's been a noticeable decline in the non-liturgical churches for confession during Sunday morning service. Now, if Lewis is right, and I believe he is, that's a very dangerous thing. The end of the first chapter of Mere Christianity, paraphrasing freely, he says something like this. He says, repentance is not something God demands of you that he could forego if he wishes. Repentance is simply a description of what coming to God is like. I think he's right. Think of your Bible knowledge that most of you are old enough to have. The younger ones were denied it. Did anyone in the Bible who had a close encounter with God start singing happy songs on the spot? That's not what happens, is it? Flat on your face, confronted with holiness. That's the only solution for the guilt part of medicine. The church has largely abrogated its responsibilities in the environment of the hospital. They need to take it back, and we need to push them into doing it. What do? We move on in the scientific way. The current trendy thing is evidence-based medicine with no definition of evidence and no definition of medicine. Certainly not the definition I've just given. And evidence really is largely authoritarian. If the paper is published in a good journal by somebody with a reputation, you believe it to be true. That's not science. The Pope could have done it better because he'd have more authority. But that's where we're at the moment. Now, it's not to say we shouldn't take good note of scientific data, but it needs a context. One of the first steps forward, in my view, would be to deal with that miserable thing, the computer. It has many uses, but it has destroyed education to a very large degree, especially in the context of science and engineering and the like, because we've developed the multiple guess approach to education, which can be marked by a computer. And as a professor, I love that. But it's very hard for a computer to test your ability to think. It may be possible one day, but currently that's not what's happening. I, in fact, began teaching a biochemistry course over 25 years ago that didn't have any requirement for memorization. I did it because I couldn't catch the cheats, and I wasn't going to have people in my class cheating to get into medical school. What I had to do was teach them how to read, how to deal with the literature, and how to write a précis. And it worked. I still meet students who remember that course and say it was the only one that taught me how to think. Hopefully students will use their power. I think medical students and law students and engineering students have every right to say to the academic elite, we practice our profession with a computer in our pocket. Why should we not take our exams in exactly the same way? A short-term failure of memory should not be a reason for failure, especially in the modern day and age where you can look it up. The question is, when you look up, can you work out which should be believed and which should not be? Judging by the students' use of Wikipedia, they've got a long way to go in that direction. But it could be a start. Most students, you see, memorize and dump in the science faculty. They could not even pass the exam they got an A for 6 weeks later, in many cases. That is not learning. That is not acceptable. What we really need is an apprenticeship-type program again, which is the way people really learn. And of course, it's patients who teach you medicine, and it's the best doctors who teach you medicine over time. When you look back, you realize the ones that you honor later are not the ones you honored when you were a student. When you're a student, you want the guy who made the exam easy. told you what the questions were going to be in effect and had his little routines which would get you through. The guys you remember later are the ones who made you think and made you look at disease and problems in a different way. There aren't too many of those. When I'm in another city, I can say to the doctors, who's the best surgeon, who's the best physician in this city? I do not get a random scattering of names. The same names come up. Then when I say, why is he the best surgeon or the best physician? For a moment, they don't know what to say. They know first. They can rationalize afterwards. This is what Polanyi calls tacit knowledge. This is well on the way to wisdom, which is what we talk about next. But tacit knowledge is something you need to have under your belt as equipment, really. The person who introduced it to us in the Western world is not much liked by philosophers, I discover. I can't understand why, because to scientists he makes absolute sense. He was a chemist in Hungary, a man called Polanyi, in fact the father of John Polanyi, who was a Nobel Prize winner in chemistry at the University of Toronto. But his father, Michael, as far as I can discover, was a non-practicing Jew. And in the period just before and during the First World War, he was a young man just beginning his career, smart enough to write to Einstein, and Einstein responded. So he was a very smart young man. And then, of course, in 1917, the Russian Revolution occurred, and there was a whole shake-up amongst Russian academics. And Polanyi happened to be there and talked to Bukharin, who was the Soviet Minister of Science at the time, and he asked him, what is Soviet science policy going to look like? And he got the standard Marxist answer: the proletariat will tell the scientists what to do. Well, Polanyi knew that wouldn't work. You can tell technicians what to do because you can tell them to apply that to this problem. But for somebody doing real science, I don't mean the PhD I-dotting T-crossing stuff, but the stuff that's virtually in the unknown at the moment, you have to be motivated. And that's a very strange phenomenon. For 25 years, one protein got me out of bed in the morning. The first time I came across it, I didn't even know it was a protein. It was the phenomenon that fascinated me, the fact that every membrane in your body has a membrane potential. Now, when I started my PhD at 18 months, I hadn't got a result. You need to be motivated under those circumstances. But it worked, obviously. That's tacit knowledge. I knew there was an important issue there. I just had to work out what it was. Polanyi used to say, you know the result of the experiment first. You do the experiment to find out whether you're right. Of course, most often, you're wrong. Einstein famously felt his equations, certainly the work that he did on light, and he interrupted a conversation to go away and work at what the man had said and stimulated a whole range of thoughts. Penrose from Oxford, who's a humanist, gives an account of spending a whole morning in his office in Oxford working on a problem, and then goes to a committee meeting the other side of Oxford High Street. He's standing on the yellow line in the middle of the street, not a safe place to stand. And suddenly he realizes what the answer to his morning's problem was. He turns around and goes back, and it takes him 3 hours to write down what he'd understood in a fraction of a second. There are no neurophysiological explanations of things like this. But when, as you grow as a physician, not only in science but also in medicine, you can get this phenomenon of tacit knowledge. You observe things in patients that you can't put your finger on, and you know what the diagnosis is. And then you have to do the tests, and sometimes you find out that you were right. I remember the first time that happened to me. A man came in to see me in London, and he was not very articulate, to be kind to him. And I asked him what was the matter, and he started stammering. And I knew he had angina. And I asked him questions and did an electrocardiogram, and yes, he had ischemic heart disease. And after, how did I get there? And I realized that in trying to find the words, I'd noticed his hands. And of course, the pain of angina is a pressure pain, and he was trying to find a word for something that felt like a grip, and I got it from that. Now, that was an easy one, but they can be much more complex than that. Conversion is the best example of tacit knowledge that I know. If you have had a conversion to faith, you will not be able to explain it to people in a way that's acceptable to a reductionistic scientist. Your conversion is your conversion. It doesn't apply to anyone else. God comes to you and the world changes. And you know it's changed. It's undeniable for you, but the evidence for other people is not so obvious. Jesus says that when Nicodemus comes to him, really a professor in those terms, and like all professors, he's envious, and who wouldn't be envious of Jesus and his teaching skills? So he comes to Jesus and basically says, how can I do it like you do it? And Jesus gives him a non-answer. He says, you can't get to where you want to go from where you are now. Unless you are born of the Spirit, you cannot comprehend the essential features of the whole thing. And that, of course, is true. And Nicodemus clearly got there, as we found out later, but not at that moment. I love those kinds of stories, and I collect them. I had a letter just last week from a young woman in the prairies who's writing some paper or other, and she came across something I'd written 20 years ago and asked whether she could quote it. And it's about this phenomenon of knowledge that is real but not describable in modern terms. Tacit knowledge. Wisdom includes this component. I had a rather interesting experience a few, I suppose 2 or 3 months back now, but I had an interesting invitation to be on cross-country checkup when they were doing a session on university education. So I ended up talking to Rex Murphy for rather longer than was initially planned. And somehow I ended up quoting C.S. Lewis. It's a paragraph that Peter Crave says is the wisest paragraph he's ever read. Certainly it's one that imprinted itself on my mind too. Lewis wrote, "For the wise men of old, the cardinal problem of human life was how to conform the soul to objective reality." That, of course, is God and God's laws for the medievals. The solution was wisdom, self-discipline, and virtue. For the modern man, the cardinal problem of human life is how to conform it to his own desires. The solution is technique. The contraceptive pill is a perfect example of technique over wisdom. But these techniques ultimately are always controlled by a few people. But these people no longer believe in God and his divine commandments, and so are not controlled by those commandments, but only by what is left to them, their own experience, their own heredity. Thus, man's conquest of nature turns out to be nature's conquest of man. To my amazement, I received a whole bunch of emails from people who've been listening to the CBC when that bit came on. And several of them said the same thing. I was amazed to hear the word wisdom on the CBC. One of the students who came to look at Augustine College as a possible place for next year, his mother was one of those. I didn't know about her till yesterday, but she said, I sat in the driveway when I got home to listen to the rest of it. There's a hunger out there, and that's the good news for us. But what do we mean by wisdom? Now, Edward Tingley has given you a whole lot of definitions of wisdom from Nietzsche to St. Augustine, so you've got the whole range there. The one that interests me most is what the Jewish people understood by it, because this turns out to be central in so many ways. It's not sophistic Greek wisdom, knowing how to win your arguments. It's masterful understanding in every area of life, whether it be artistic, technical, governmental, even warfare. There are ways to do it which are wise. They're different from clever, deeper than that. How is it transmitted? Well, the Bible is very clear, something that we don't talk about. More than once in the Bible, it says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Now people say, fear? Yes, fear. Fear is a very important thing for your children to acquire, isn't it? Appropriate fear. In Jamaica, we had an early spectrometer, which was a pain to set up. And the Jamaican power supply was also a pain. So it could take several hours to calibrate this thing. And then the power would go off. You'd have to start all over again. But if the power came on within 5 minutes, there was a short circuit. The side was taken off this machine, which would be illegal in Canada. And on the side it said, be careful. the reason was that in order to short-circuit it, you had to reach inside and flick a little micro switch. But there was a bare wire there which had 1,000 volts running through it. So the be careful was appropriate. That is appropriate fear. And the Bible says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And it's not confined to Christians. Hippocrates begins his oath for physicians by asking the person who's going to learn medicine to vow by Apollo, Hygeia, Panacea, Asclepius, and all the gods and goddesses. That's all he had. I mean, he was a polytheistic pagan. But he understood something which is perfectly rational. Should you fear your doctor? Should you trust your doctor more or less if he believes that he will be judged for his behavior after death? That's a no-brainer, isn't it? If it isn't a no-brainer to you, you need to go back to some very basic logic. Obviously, if I was a Darwinian and I could kill you to my profit and advance my genes, I ought to do so, if it really is a question of a battle of the genes, as Dawkins says it is. By the way, the best deconstruction of this that I know is David Stove's in a wonderful book called Darwinian Fairy Tales. Altruism is the Achilles heel of Darwinism. There's no proper understanding of individual altruism. There's a group method worked out by Willie Hamilton, and when he died, they were still giving him accolades for work done years before in nature and science, but it doesn't describe human behavior. It requires that before you do an altruistic act, you do a swift calculus of how many shared genes you have. Nobody does that. It doesn't describe who we are. It doesn't describe our humanity. Now, the Jewish understanding of how wisdom comes about is deeply involved in something else that we have forgotten to do or have cast aside thoughtlessly. The Shema Israel, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your strength. What comes next? Raise your hand if you know. One or two sort of at this level. Shall I try you? What comes next? Thank you. That is the wrong answer. You will never forget the right answer now. That's in Leviticus, not in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is much more interesting. It says, these things shall be upon your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your children. When you rise up, when you lie down, when you go on a journey, at the dining room table. The Jews have inculturated this, Orthodox Jews. And if you ask Orthodox Jews why they do so well academically, I mean, when the next Nobel Prizes come out, the biggest winners will be 15 million Jews, every time. By far. They may be American or British or French, but that's the culture that wins the hard Nobel Prizes. Not the silly ones like peace, but the real ones, mathematics, biochemistry, medicine. Now, why is that? They say it's because of this injunction. And Moses a little later tells you why it's important and how to do it. He says, when your son asks you for the meaning of what you do, asks you, where does the wisdom come from in our society? Don't give him a lecture. That's not there. It is there, but it's not in print. It's between the words. He says, tell him the story. We were slaves in Egypt. God rescued us, brought us through the desert into the promised land. Since your son's most likely to say that church is boring, you can then say to him, don't you think we should give an hour a week to a God who does things like that? And until 7, they're honest. Then they've learnt rationalization from you. So you've got 7 years to get these things in, really, or roughly that. The Catholics understand that too. You see, what happens, you don't explain the stories, you just teach them. And they've got minds like steel traps for stories, haven't they? So what you've done is you've put the money in the bank for later moral decisions. The point about Jewish history, unlike, say, ours or the Americans or the Brits, which is revisionist, they always make their heroes out to be good guys when usually they're not. Whereas the Jewish history, he did evil in the sight of the Lord, he did evil in the sight of the Lord, I think 12 times in a row at one point. They're realistic about human nature. They accept that the fall is real and it's something you can rely on. You can't rely on altruism or goodness in the same way. That means that they learn a morally consequential view of life. Whereas most of our education system now is dedicating to teaching children otherwise. We destroy words instead of giving them meaning. When a child arrives at kindergarten, you give them finger paints and they play and make a smudge on the paper. The Faculty of Education teaches the young teachers to say how beautiful that is. Well, it's not. It's a mess. Now, there may be a child there who has some sense of colour, And you can actually see that that child has some sense of colour. And you can put them up and say, which is the prettiest one? You might then be doing something that's worth doing. It might be something like real teaching. But when you tell a child that a mess is artistic or creative, you've just destroyed the words artistic and creative. It's not honest, not truthful. Now, the Jewish way of being honest leads to moral consequence. And the virtues, including wisdom, are taught that way. They know the stories. On my website, there are about 60, I think, metaphors or phrases from English literature that are biblical in origin. And the answers are not there, but from the 3 or 4 words, you have to get to the story because you don't understand it if you don't get to the story. I quite often was asked to talk in Frush Week in the medical school because they wanted somebody who could be vaguely amusing and say something that might be useful. And I got to do that. And I would often say to the students, we are going to teach you medicine on the biopsychosocial model of medicine. And as far as I'm concerned, that model has been weighed in the balances and found wanting. And my guess is that no more than one of you know what I have just said, and it was usually about 1 in 100. How many of you get that one? Almost right. It's Belshazzar, actually, but it'll do. The next king on, yes. The Belshazzar had taken the sacred vessels of the Jews and profaned them for an orgy. And in the middle of the orgy, the hand starts to write on the wall, many, many tekel upharsin. And of course, even when you're drunk, hands writing on the wall must be upsetting. So they sent for Daniel, who obviously wasn't there. And he says, be it known unto you, King Belshazzar, that the words mean that you and your kingdom have been weighed in the balances and found wanting, and you will be dead in the morning. We know the date it happened. Darius was draining the canals in which Belshazzar trusted. It was all over for him. I wasn't saying that the biopsychosocial model is a few grams underweight, which is what they thought. I was saying it was profanely and profoundly inadequate to think that you could understand a person's illness and not treat them as a spiritual being. That doesn't make any sense at all. Now, this requirement for a book was pushed into my way in the 1980s. It's amazing the people God has used to get to me. Alan Bloom was a radically atheistic homosexual, but also a superb teacher of Plato and Aristotle. And in The Closing of the American Mind, he wrote about this. And I'm going to read to you 3 paragraphs, actually, which you shouldn't do in a lecture because you'll go to sleep. But I don't think you will with this particular passage. Think about your own family history. He's talking about the cause of the decay in the family. The cause of this decay of the family's traditional role as transmitter of tradition is the same as that of the decay of the humanities. Nobody believes that the old books do or even could contain the truth. In the United States, practically speaking, the Bible was the only common culture, one that united simple and sophisticated, rich and poor, young and old, and as the very model for a vision of the order of the whole of things, as well as the key to the rest of Western art, the greatest works of which were in one way or another responsive to the Bible. It provided access to the seriousness of books. With its gradual and inevitable disappearance, the very idea of such a total book and the possibility and necessity of a world explanation is disappearing. Fathers and mothers have lost the idea that the highest aspirations they might have for their child is for them to be wise, as prophets, priests, or philosophers are wise. No, specialized competence and success are all they can imagine today. Now, Bloom goes on to think about his own family history, and he says, my grandparents were ignorant people by our standards, and my grandfather held only lowly jobs. He never went inside an institution of higher learning. But their home was spiritually rich, because all the things done in it, not only what was specifically ritual, found their origin in the Bible's commandments and their explanation in the Bible's stories and commentaries on them. And they had their imaginary counterparts in the deeds of the myriad of exemplary heroes found in the Bible. My grandparents found reasons for the existence of their family and the fulfillment of their duties in serious writings, and they interpreted their special sufferings with respect to a great and ennobling past. Their simple faith and practices linked them to great scholars and thinkers who dealt with the same material not from outside or from an alien perspective, but believing as they did, while simply going deeper and providing guidance. There was a respect for real learning because it had a felt connection with their lives. And here I think is one of the most beautiful definitions of a community that I know, and also one that works. This, says Bloom, is what a community and a history mean. A common experience inviting high and low into a single body of belief. Multiculturalism will not do it. What is the story that's going to hold us together is what Bloom is saying. Now, he goes on, I do not believe that my generation, that's my age, my cousins who have been educated in the American way, all of whom are MDs or PhDs, three-generation Jewish success story. He doesn't believe that they have any comparable learning. When they talk about heaven and earth, the relationships between husbands and wives, parents and children, the human condition, I hear nothing but cliches, superficialities, the material of satire. I am not saying anything so trite as that life is fuller when people have myths to live by. I mean rather that a life based on the book is closer to the truth, that it provides the material for deeper research in and access to the real nature of things. Without the great revelations, epics and philosophies as part of our natural vision, there is nothing to see out there, and eventually little left inside. The Bible is not the only means to furnish a mind, but without a book of similar gravity, read with the gravity of a potential believer, the mind will remain unfinished. And wisdom, of course, impossible. How did this all happen? I don't think anybody can deny that it has happened, right? Until relatively recently, I used to say we're becoming neo-pagans, and then David Hart convinced me I was wrong. It's worse than that. Currently, we're soft nihilists on our way to hard nihilism. That's a much worse thing than paganism, which at least had honor as one of its virtues. But Bloom and Lewis agree that it has happened. But what happened to make the comparison between the wise men of old and the modern world so invidious? This leads us to the question of what happened in the Middle Ages, which culminated in the kind of scientism that Dawkins and others preach today. Admittedly, it took 500 years, 600. First of all, the much maligned medieval people had higher ideals than we have. In particular, they believed that good lives required high purposes. To use the word purpose in the biology department today is to commit heresy. A colleague of mine's daughter, writing an essay on the heart, said that it was a wonderfully designed machine and got a great big red strike across the whole page saying, if you use the word designed in my course again, you will fail. That's where we're at the moment. Nevertheless, we all have purposes in our lives, although our purposes are, by and large, not concerned with God, but with our own happiness, usually defined entirely subjectively. For the medieval world, Aristotle's four causes dominated the intellectual scene. Qualities were more important than quantities, and the purpose of your life was the most important of all of them. Now, of course, God has his own revenge, particularly in molecular biology at the moment. In 1953, when DNA was first got, so to speak, it was a physicist, not Watson and Crick, who understood what it was. He said immediately, that's a code, a coded message. That's a problem, isn't it, for a world without design? But that's what it is. And of course, in due course, we cracked the code and we could identify some genes. And we could snip those genes up with biochemical scissors and get them into solution and make them work. All looked very good, but of course, when we got that protein, we had to ask, what's it for? You push Lady Teleology out the front door, she comes in at the back. We can't live without her. All the while, we have to ask, what's it for? How does it work? And of course, it's getting so incredibly complex now that it's almost laughable. If you want more detail, read John Lennox. Has Science Buried... God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God? It's a brilliant little book, mathematics being brought to bear on the question of the human genome in a very good way. This all started in terms of reductionism with Occam, I think, who I've already mentioned. He denied that things like love and goodness and beauty and truth and justice have any material existence, which is true. And he said, therefore they're just words, really. He was trying to defend God. You should never bother. God can defend himself. But he said we need to collect things, facts, things that we can appreciate with our senses or their extension in instruments. And it was no time at all before Bacon had changed the meaning of the word fact. Newton was probably the last one who understood the distinction. He actually said, I feign no hypotheses. He meant that he was just giving a mathematical description of the world which worked. He didn't pretend it was the truth. The Newtonians thought it was, and it was going to be some time before it was shown to be a limited truth. It wasn't long after that, about 100 years after the death of Newton, that Laplace, when questioned by Napoleon about where God fitted in his science, famously replied saying, Sire, I have no need of the hypothesis of God in order to do science. And that's quite correct. Science is methodologically driven, but you wouldn't have got to those methods in the first place if you hadn't believed there was a God underlying the apparent surface chaos of life. And it needed a Christian to do that. I think in 1277, when the teaching of Aristotle was banned in the University of Paris, that the teachers, you imagine being a teacher and having your notes taken away in August and you've got to teach in September. It would not be a pleasant experience. I imagine they probably went to the pub and got drunk, so to speak. But when they sobered up, I like to imagine a conversation like this happened. One of them said, we can't teach deductive Aristotelian logic, but inductive logic isn't forbidden. Now, Aristotle knew about it but didn't trust it because of his way of understanding the world. They said, but God told us that we should be stewards of nature and we should have power over it, but we don't have much. Maybe it's because we're trying too difficult a problem. To get from God to the particulars is beyond us. But if God made the world, then his character must show in that world. So we can trust experiments. So from 5 experiments, we might extrapolate to something else. And it's worked many times in subsequent history of the Western world. It did work. But you would never have done that in the first place if you hadn't believed that there was a God of order behind the whole of the perceived world. Now, if you want to read about that in a little bit more deeply and get references to go further, if you haven't come across Rodney Stark, he's worth reading because he's an academic who was a journalist first, so he actually isn't trying to play silly games with you and show off. He actually writes very clearly. And in a book called For the Glory of God, the chapter on God's handiwork, nature, is brilliant. He wrote it, he said, because he thought no one knew this stuff, and then he discovered that historians of science have known it for 20 years. The standard book is Lindbergh's book, but it's a long book. The one chapter in Stark is a much easier way to do it, and it will give you a beginnings of understanding of what's going on here. Scientism is a problem. It leaves us no space for the things that really matter. I often say to students, I hope that you've all noticed that all the things that matter to you most have one thing in common, and that thing, of course, is no material existence. You cannot live without love and honor and justice and fidelity. You can live without a Lexus or a lot of other things, but not without those things. And they have no material existence. Therefore, science, as such, has nothing to say about them. Now, wisdom varies from culture to culture. Its deep principles are the same, but its practical outworkings may differ. Now, that could take a long while or a short one. I'm going to take the short one because I'm sure I'm using up more time than I should. I need to tell you only one true story that happened to me for a few years ago for you to see how the actual outworkings of honor in this case could be quite different in different cultures. I saw a little girl who had a badly neglected septic knee, and when I saw her, she was septicemic and dying, and she had pus in the tibia and in the femur. The only thing we could do to save her life, the knee joint was destroyed anyway, was to cut off her leg, get the pus out, and fill her with antibiotics, such as we had. So I told the parents that, and they said, well, we need to think about it. And I said, well, in 20 minutes, the OR will be ready. Well, in those 20 minutes, they took her home to die. She undoubtedly died. There's no way she would survive. I was the only person who was horrified. And I said to the nurses with whom I'd done rounds earlier, do you mind if I talk to you? They said, no problem. And I said, what would those parents have done if this had been a little boy? And that was just the right question. They said, oh, they would have done the amputation. I said, why would you treat little boys and little girls differently? And they said, in our culture, it is a woman's job to till the fields, fetch the water, cook the food, and bear the children. A woman with one leg cannot do those things, so she'll have a life not worth living. Nowadays, you're going to hear it used about the quality of your life in a little while. Same idea. Now, I hope that all of you agree that the current model in Canada of treating little boys and little girls equally is a better model. But both are expressions of honour in the society. Honour is always there. And over time, we learn from one another. Now, to redress the balance on this particular one, that same culture will not believe that we in Canada have working poor people with inadequate housing, and we do. They say, surely a rich country like yours can help one another build a house, because that's what they do. They understand the communal duty for everybody to have a roof when they can no longer put it on their hut. They don't understand that we don't understand that. I mean, it is an obscenity, isn't it, to have $150,000 cars running around the streets when some people have inadequate housing. That's not a civilized society. Now, I'm near the end. You can relax. But you seem to be paying attention. I can't see anyone going to sleep, but such is life. Eliot and Jacques Barzun is what I put as the title of the next bit. If you've not come across Jacques Barzun, From Dawn to Decadence, the history of the last 500 years, is an incredible little book. Well, it's not a little book, it's this thick, but it's well worth reading. Now, in those lines of Eliot that I used, and those of Lewis, it's the same thought, but Eliot was more pessimistic and more specific about the loss of the Christian meta-narrative. Your fathers, he says, built upon the cornerstone of Jesus Christ, but you sit in a building not fitly framed together. And not many students would know where that phrase comes from. Where many are born to idleness, to frittered lives and squalid deaths, embittered scorn in honeyless hives. The wealthy and successful like us, he describes thus. Here we're a godless people, their only monument the asphalt road and 1,000 lost golf balls. We laugh, don't we, because it's true. It's true. Driving and golf, at which you get worse every day, as you get older anyway. What would he write, what would Eliot write today if he stood outside the high school at throwing out time? This is a picture of boredom and ennui, isn't it? Without ambition and without love of learning in most cases. This is what Barzun means by decadent in the title, From Dawn to Decadence. All that is meant by decadence, he says, is falling off. It implies in those who live at such a time no loss of energy or talent or moral sense. On the contrary, it is a very active time full of deep concerns, fighting nuclear power, global warming, abortion, saving the environment, promoting organic food. But it is particularly restless, for it sees no clear lines of advance. The loss it faces is the loss of possibility. The forms of art, as of life, seem exhausted. The stages of development have been run through. Institutions function painfully. Repetition and frustration are the intolerable result. Boredom and fatigue are great historical forces. He ends his book with hope that young people will begin again to study their lost cultural history and it will resurrect enthusiasm. He gives no reason for that hope. Eliot's poem depicts the dispirited working class who no longer have joy and a sense of pride in their mastery of techniques. I know about that. I grew up in that environment. My grandfather and my uncles were all tool makers. They were proud of their skills. They had human dignity. My grandfather could work to a 10,000th of an inch. That's nothing to modern computer-assisted design. Nowadays, those same blue-collar workers have no equivalent pride because it's all done by machines and robots. it's tragic. And you go to Britain and you see this decay so very, very clearly. It is frightening. Likewise, Bloom's description of the decline of the university is true. I remember one of the turning points in my own career. I say it was Graham Hunter who discovered it, but he says it was me. But one of us stumbled across Bernard of Clairvaux's wonderful lines from the 12th century. Some seek knowledge for the sake of knowledge, that is curiosity. Others seek knowledge in order that they themselves may be known, that is vanity. From that day onwards, I call my CV my curriculum vanitas. Others seek knowledge in order to sell it, that is dishonorable. That means not making a living, but making a killing. You hurt your own soul when you do that. And then finally, some seek knowledge in order to edify others, and that is love. And I was not guilty of that. I didn't even learn the names of the 20 students in my fourth-year honours biochemistry class. And I said to Sally that evening that the students I taught did not enjoy learning as we did when we were at school. And they had little or no social contact with professors, as we did. We had lots of contact. And she said, why don't you bring them home to supper? I said, would you feed them? And she said, of course. And I did. And to my amazement, they came. We had a good meal. Sally's a good cook. And then we started talking. They didn't leave till midnight. They came from good homes, but there had never been any discussion about the purpose of life, the meaning of life. The big questions have simply not been touched. So it became a regular phenomenon. Here's Neil Postman's take. He says reductionism takes seriously only measurable facts. It brought us modern science and technology which dramatically improved our material comfort, but its answers to existential questions such as where do I come from and where am I going are very unsatisfactory. An accident caused us and our end is meaningless. As Neil Postman puts it, to many people, the accidental life is not worth living. In the naturalistic world of the angry atheist, there is no rational place for mercy and no meaning. Advanced technology is not the answer to today's problems. It spews out vast quantities of largely useless or worse false information and makes the acquisition of the useful data harder to get at. The first person I know to think about this was George Grant, one of Canada's best scholars who doesn't get much publicity, certainly never on the CBC. He was concerned about this in a marvelous essay entitled Technology and Justice, which shows that our changes in self-understanding and our morality have been wrought by technology. We have been desensitized by an insidious process. The account of reason which produced modern science and technology also produced the accounts of justice, which are subsumed by political philosophies. Now let me illustrate. Imagine the invention of the internal combustion engine. For the sake of my analogy, let's say a young man in a rural community invents the internal combustion engine. Now it's a fertile area, but the village is just too far from the nearest large towns for them to get their food to market in a fresh state. So they're limited by the inability to get their produce to market. And then this young man invents the internal combustion engine, and he goes to the village elders and he says, I've just made us rich. We're going to get all our produce to market. I've made a machine that will go 4 times faster than a horse and carry a much bigger weight. But the elders are wise. They say, this machine, does it have any drawbacks? Will anybody be damaged by it? And let's say that the young man is prescient. He said, oh yes, a few thousand people will die every year in America because of this machine in due course. Do you think they would have accepted it as a reasonable machine at that point? The answer is no, isn't it? But there's absolutely no way that we would go back from where we are now. We have been desensitized in that process. Respect for life has been declining in all sorts of areas. Abortion is merely the tip of the iceberg, and you're going to see much more of it in your own lifetime. George Grant does a wonderful discussion of how technology has had much deeper effects on our society than we usually think of. Now, the last example I want to use, before a very small coda on the good news, is the law. The law used to be the pursuit of justice, but by this same process, it has become the pursuit of power. That's loss of wisdom. The person who does the best job on this, for me anyway, is a man called Arthur Leff, who taught common law at Yale. And he gave the lecture from which I'm about to quote in 1979. He was worried about law students, rightly so. He says, I want to believe, and so do you, in a complete, transcendent and immanent set of propositions about right and wrong, findable rules that authoritatively and unambiguously direct us as to how to live our lives righteously. I want to believe, and so do you, in no such thing, but rather that we are wholly free, not only to choose for ourselves what we ought to do, but to decide for ourselves individually and as species what we ought to be. What we want, heaven help us, is to be simultaneously perfectly ruled and perfectly free. That is at the same time to discover the right and the good and to invent it. Now, he's an unbelieving Jew. He wants the law to be from God, transcendent, because only if that is true are both the judges and the judged under the same authority. And only then is real justice possible. As Lewis has pointed out, if you don't believe in that God, you're going to use your power for whatever purposes you want. Hence, all our Supreme Court justices think that they don't discover the law, they invent it, driven by social necessity as they understand it. Then Leff does something very amazing. He writes 20 pages of lucid prose. Not many academics can do that, but he does it. And then at the end, he says this. He says that Darwin's right. He can't buck social Darwinianism. All I can say is this. It looks as if we are all that we have. But he's honest. He goes on. Given what we know about ourselves and about each other, this is an extraordinarily unappetizing prospect. Looking around the world, it appears that if all men are brothers, the ruling model is Cain and Abel. I have to explain who Cain and Abel were in many universities nowadays. Neither reason nor love nor even terror seems to work to make us good. And worse than that, there is no reason why anything should. Only if ethics were something unspeakable by us would law be unnatural and therefore unchallengeable. As things stand now, everything is up for grabs. Women's studies, black studies, homosexual studies all teach that the law is about power, not about justice. And there are multiple examples of lying in court to advance the agenda. Leff himself can't live with his conclusion, so he adds a tailpiece, totally negating what he just said. He says, nevertheless, napalming babies is bad, starving the poor is wicked, buying and selling each other is depraved. There is in this world such a thing as evil. He just said there wasn't. He knew what he should do. He was well trained. If you have a technically correct argument and you arrive at an unsustainable conclusion, you must revisit the premise. He ought to rewrite that last paragraph to say, because we know that it's bad to napalm babies and depraved to sell one another, because we know that, then it looks to me as though we are not all that we have, because the only way we can get to that conclusion is if there is someone above us. So what's the good news? There is good news. Some of the liberal elites are beginning to recognize this phenomenon. The two that I mentioned immediately, and you can no doubt find others, are Jürgen Habermas in Germany, who's written a book with Ratzinger, now the ex-Pope Benedict, in which it's Habermas who says, anyone in the Western world who doesn't acknowledge that our ideas of justice came from the Jews and our ideas of compassion came from the Christians is simply ignorant. That's where they came from. The other one is Robert Fogel, who wrote a book around 2000 called The Fourth Great Awakening. Now, Robert Fogel is another Jew. He's a Nobel Prize winner in economics. And I met him in the University of Chicago because I was there to do grand rounds, and they asked me if there's anyone I'd like to meet. And so, not being shy about these things, I said, can you arrange for me to meet Robert Fogel? And they did. And I asked him about his book. And he said, well, very few people have engaged with it. I said, why did you write it? And he said, well, I'm a secular Jew, born and brought up in New York and lived my life in Chicago, but I did a very un-Jewish thing. I married a black Episcopalian lady. And she had died a few years before, and he missed her very deeply. And he said, when she'd gone, I realized that the reason I was proud of my children was because of what she had taught them, not what I had taught them. And he predicts the financial meltdown, in effect. And this is around 2000. And he says, you can't trust the people who are running the economic system. The problem is not fixable by the university with its obsession with technique, because the defect doesn't lie at that level. And he gives a list of 15 virtues which he says are going to be in short supply. They're about 60 pages into the book. And if you're interested, I can give them to you afterwards. But they're not material things, they're immaterial things. Like the things we've been discussing, they amount, in fact, to wisdom and virtue, which is what we are about in Augustine College. We want to provide students with the means to be able to deal with the modern multiversity, and they're doing so. One of last year's students stopped a professor in the first semester at Mac, where he foolishly put up an overhead in the biopsychosocial bit of the course, which began, "There are no absolutes." And Nathan raised his hand and said, "Sir, is that question internally consistent?" And of course the whole class laughed. Fortunately, the prof was a smart guy. He realized he was thoroughly beaten. He did the only thing you can do under those circumstances. He said, "Thank you, it's a stupid sentence, isn't it? I must remove it." It is a stupid sentence. Without the law of non-contradiction, we have nothing. So we are seeing successes like that, and we are seeing students who develop a Christian character over time and are going to serve us well. To say that religion ought to be excluded from education is a moral position itself. The very word "ought" tells you that. And it has a very bad track record, doesn't it? Removing the world's ancient religions from the political arena produced Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot. Ask any of their citizens whether they approved of the experience. But we're a bit like the people that Elijah didn't know about. Remember, after his success with the prophets of Baal, Elijah was depressed because he said, only I am left." God said no. There are 7,000 people who haven't bowed the knee to Baal. The problem was they were so private about it that Elijah didn't know who they were. The same thing is true in our workplaces, isn't it? We have got to become more articulate. And I hope that I've encouraged you that it's possible. Thank you. Well, of course, that's the perfect illustration of what I'm talking about, isn't it? Canada does, but we have some subgroups from other cultures that don't. And when you arrive in Canada, you don't dump the culture you came from immediately. And we know about that, and that's going to be an educational process. But yes, it is the problem of having multiple cultures and bringing them together at the rate that we've been doing. There will be difficulties, and we're going to need a lot of patience and a lot of hard work. But I think we don't do ourselves any service by not pointing them out. I think the current process of having people about whom you can say, well, is that a good way to do things? That's all you need to do. You don't need to make statements, just ask questions. And it's not the mothers who are having the abortions that are the problem, it's their husbands who want a boy. I mean, we know that in China and South Asia, there's well over 90 million missing women. So much so that the UN Women's Committee has ordered China to legalize prostitution. That doesn't sound sensible, does it? But they realize that sexually frustrated men will make the streets untenable for women. It wasn't what they intended, but it's where they've got to. We have lost our way completely. And of course, in my view, one of the worst things we did was to take the Bible out of high school, 40, 50 years ago. In Britain, they kept it because they said, you have to have the Bible, because if you don't know the Bible, you can't read Shakespeare with understanding. We did it the wrong way. We made it a religious issue. It should have been made a cultural issue. It's not too late to, well, every decent university in their English department have a course on the Bible as English literature now, because the students wouldn't know the metaphors otherwise. But thank you for the question. Yes, well, abortion is it's not really the issue either. It's a symptom of a deeper issue in my way. I didn't talk about abortion for many years. I first did it about a dozen years ago in Wayne State University in Detroit, against my will. Students called me because my wife had set up a website, and so they know where I'm going. And the students in Detroit know that if I'm going to many places, I'm going to go through Detroit. And I was going to Ann Arbor, and they called and said, "Can you talk to us first?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "Well, it will be January the 22nd, which is the anniversary of the Roe v. Wade decision. We want you to talk about abortion in the medical school in the middle of the day." And I said, "Well, I don't do that." And they said, "We think you could. We've heard you talk on other issues." I said, "That's very kind of you, but it doesn't make me any the whit, one more whit willing to do it." And then they did the Christian thing and said, "We've been praying about it." And I had been pro-choice for 20 years, going back to rubella babies and feeling that it was a woman's issue and I had nothing to say about it. And then I had, while Sally was away in Africa, I was a widower, so to speak, for a while. And during that period, I had sat down one afternoon in my office, bored with my proper work, and asked myself the question I should have asked many years before: can I think that? And at the end of the afternoon, I knew that I couldn't, and moreover, I could show that I didn't think anybody could. I talked to Robert Spitzer about it, because he's good at these things, and he agreed that it would probably work. So I go through that process that I mentioned of asking about who you trust, and then getting to the point of saying, well, what, if any, duties do we owe to the unborn is a moral question. Now, there's no agreement, I know, in this Department of Medicine or this medical school on that issue, and yet on other issues you trust one another. So the real issue is not abortion at all, is it? It's, if you wish to be coherent, what must you believe in order for abortion to be ethical? And what must you believe in order for it to be unethical? And that is a question that is worth discussing, because first it allows you to point out that both sides are rational. But in order, I think, to be a pro-choice liberal, you must believe that life has no ultimate meaning. Then you can have an ethics of net happiness. And before you're conscious, you're neither happy nor unhappy. So snuffing out the absurd, unselfconscious life increases the net happiness in the world, but only if there are no consequences, and only if life is ultimately without meaning. You put Mother Teresa by the bed, you get the exact opposite situation. And then I do an outcome analysis of both sides. And I call it the domino effect of Roe v. Wade. It was supposed to be only 12 weeks. Now we've reached the point where we don't have a law. And the Dutch have even published an article in the New England Journal of Medicine, the Groningen proposals, for killing newborn babies that are in no imminent danger of death simply because their quality of life is judged by the doctors to be not worth living. That would certainly get rid of Helen Keller and a few useful people like that. And of course, we have been killing the elderly for some time unofficially, and in many places now officially. And the moment you do it officially, all the guidelines are overthrown within a few years, as in Holland. So we go on down the line. It's changed the nature of justice. It's related to the animal rights movement. It's even undone the common good. One of the last patients I saw before I stopped doing clinical medicine was a little guy with cerebral palsy will never walk or talk or feed himself. And they also can't be fed because their swallowing mechanism is about 10% of the normal efficiency. So we were putting permanent feeding tubes in, little buttons. Initially in those days we put a soft tube in the OR and I put the button in outpatients. Well, this particular lady came along, and it took most mums 2 years to reach that point, but she got there in 6 months. So I put the tube in, and then I said, "Do you mind explaining to me how you got here so quickly?" And she said, "Well, I married young, and my family had a family, and they've grown up and left. And I was very lonely, so God gave me a baby who will never grow up." And then she explained how this little guy, who will never walk or talk or feed himself, is civilizing a whole neighborhood. Because the kids with single parents and both working parents who used to come in and watch awful television now come to her house, her home in the apartment block, because there's a little guy fed with a syringe through a little button on his belly. That's cool. They all want to try. So they're taught to be gentle, to take their turn, and she's eliminating unnecessary language from their speech. That's not a bad outcome for a little guy who can neither walk, talk, or feed himself. We want to get rid of all those. At least 30 groups of children are destined to be eliminated by eugenic abortions on the basis of the Human Genome Project. When we've done that, Ottawa will no longer be able to run a really good children's hospital because they won't have sufficient practice. At the moment, you need slightly over $1 million to run a decent pediatric hospital. When this is finished, you'll need $3 million. It's not going to be easy. There's all sorts of consequences built in. The lecture finishes the same way every time. I say, I've laid out 2 worlds for you. Which one do you want to give to your children? Dead silence every time, because even the pro-choicers actually want the pro-life world in the logical consequence category. So thank you for the question.
So is there any hope?
Oh, yes, there is. When things work, they get cloned. What we've done at Augustine College only really needs a core group of 4 people. It could and should be done in every university town. Because the young people who take this course have something like a 90% probability of coming out of university with a flourishing faith, as opposed to 20 or 30% if you don't do a course like this. Many of you have been through it. You know how devastating it can be. So yes, there's hope. The other thing is question periods are going on, and the more liberal they are, the more desperate they are. So in New York, I've had a 3-hour question period. In Arizona, the same. The record is St. Petersburg, Russia, where it went for 5 hours. The more desperate it gets, the more serious the questions. And the answers are there. They will rediscover them. But we need to become articulate, and we need to get involved. Talk to me later about the ways in which you can. You can obviously think of one immediately. Well, it's all those things that I mentioned, reductionism, relativism, and the rest. And it's a misunderstood personal happiness as well, which has become so subjective. If you want to go into that a little bit further, you can go to my website. There's a talk called The 4 Levels of Happiness. It's a free downloadable MP3 file. I probably share it with every third person I sit next to on an aeroplane. And everybody goes all the way. I've never had anyone who doesn't want to go all the way. They don't know about the higher levels of happiness. And of course, the 4th one is knowing God. So animal happiness, performance happiness, service happiness, and knowing God. And it works.